All right, thank you for attending. My name is Sergio. I work the server team at Canonical, and I am responsible for the Debuginfod instance in Ubuntu and Debian as well. But today I'm going to talk about the Ubuntu one. So before we start, how many of you have debugged some package in Ubuntu without Debuginfod? All right, great. And with Debuginfod. All right, great, awesome. So just going to explain what the project is first, for those who don't know. It started at Red Hat in around 2019. At the time, I was actually working at Red Hat, and I know the folks who started it, so they're pretty good at just tool chain stuff. So it's an awesome project, and it is a client-server project that automatically distributes ELF, Dwarf, and source code to debuggers or other Debuginfod consumer clients across HTTP. So in a nutshell, the intention is that you won't need to install, in our case, apt install the deb packages anymore in order to get access to Debuginfod for the packages that you're debugging. You just have to fire up GDB. GDB will do its job behind the scenes, recognize which Debuginfod it needs to do its job, and it will contact the Debuginfod server and ask for the Debuginfod. So it can do more than that, and I'm gonna get into it by the end of this slide. So there's a Debuginfod server. So how does it work? So we have our Debuginfod server, which has been running for a few months now, and it is indexing. Right now, it's indexing all of the supported Debuginfod for Ubuntu releases. So Bionic, Focal, Jammy, and Kinetic, and now Lunar, they're all being indexed. When you use GDB and you point GDB to, or you instruct GDB to use the Debuginfod server, it will link against libdebuginfod, which is the client side, and the client will perform the request to the Debuginfod server. When GDB needs the Debuginfod, it will get the build ID of the program. So the build ID is a hash that is generated when you compile an object file on GCC and Clang or whatever. And that hash identifies the binary and the Debuginfod that is associated with it. So both have the same hash. So that's why GDB only knows about the binary, but it knows the binary's build ID. So it just requests, oh, hey, give me the Debuginfod for that build ID. And the Debuginfod has the build ID, but it doesn't know about the binary. It doesn't care about the binary. It just sends the Debuginfod over the wire. In our case, HTTPS. And that's pretty much it, actually. It's a simple concept. So how do you use it? So if you're using Kinetic onward, you just have to install GDB or whatever Debuginfod consumer application there is. So you're going to get, by default, GDB will be configured to use Ubuntu's Debuginfod, and you don't have to do anything else. Jammy and previous versions of Ubuntu, Focal or Bionic in this case, they don't have, let's talk about Jammy first. So Jammy supports, GDB and Jammy supports Debuginfod, but you have to manually configure GDB in order to contact the server. I am working with the SRE team in order to come up with an idea on how to better support the service out of the box in Jammy, but I don't know if an SRU is the right way to go. Maybe backports is the right way to go. I don't know. I'm not very concerned about that right now. I'm concerned about expanding the service and meeting the goals that I'm going to talk about later. So for Focal and Bionic, the problem is that GDB in Focal and Bionic it doesn't support Debuginfod. So even if you export the variable that tells GDB, hey, use Debuginfod, GDB won't know what to do. And as I said, like in this case, it's more complicated still because I don't think I'll be able to convince the SRE team that a GDB MRE is justified. So I think the backports is a way to go here for those who are interested. Yeah, so how do you configure? As I said, there's this Debuginfod URLs variable that you can just set with the URL of the Debuginfod service you want. And that's it. GDB will know what to do after this. So let me do a demo for you guys. I hope things don't break, but if we do, I mean, we're in a session about GDB and debugging, and so if they do, we can debug, right? So it's okay. Should be fine. Let me put this. All right. So here I have, Here I have a Debuginfod client running on Kinetic. What I did here is I installed GDB, and I also downloaded a source code for a package that I like, that I usually use as a demonstration here. So poke in this case, in order to show you how to debug things with Debuginfod, but also how to point GDB to the right source code and all. So if you just GDB poke here, oh yeah, sorry. Let me show you that this variable is pointing to the right location. I didn't have to do anything. As I said, after I installed GDB, this is set and good to go. So if you start GDB and start debugging poke, GDB will detect that the variable exists and it will ask you, do you want to use it? It's more of a privacy concern, just make sure that you really know what you're doing and intend. So in our case, yes, I want to use it. It was very fast here, but you probably could see GDB downloading the debug info for poke. It stores the debug info inside the .cache Debuginfod client directory, and it knows that here's poke's debug info. So if I start things here, start in GDB means put a breakpoint, a temporary breakpoint in the main function, and then run the program. So it will stop at main. If I start things here, you're going to see that GDB will download every Debuginfod that is associated with the libraries that poke links against. So this is one of the coolest things I think about Debuginfod, and one of the things that people like the most is that you don't need to mess or fiddle with which libraries do I need Debuginfod for, which versions of libraries do I need Debuginfod for. GDB takes care of everything for you. It knows the build IDs of everything, so it just requests, and Debuginfod just sends the data. However, if you see that GDB stopped at the main function as I instructed it to, however, it didn't find any source code, which is kind of expected. If you're debugging things in Ubuntu or Debian, I think you have experienced this a lot. And this is because GDB doesn't know where the source code is. So you have to point it to it. So let's, as I said, the source code is here, poke 2.4 plus EFSG. So let's start GDB, and yes. And then I'll say, hey, look at this directory for source code as well, and start the program again. So now GDB found the source code. You can see it's here. It's OK. This is right now. This is what you have to do if you want to debug a package in Ubuntu or Debian. They both pretty much work the same way right now. Let me go back to the presentation because. So what are the future plans for Debuginfod? And this is coming in this next cycle for Lunar. The first one, and I think the most important, most exciting one, is source code indexing. And what is source code indexing? Let me go back to the demo, and I'll show you. Okay, so as I said, this is situation right now. Let me just exit here. Oh, by the way, do you guys know about TUI, Text User Interface in JDB? No? So Control X and then A, Control X A. You get into the TUI. If you want to go out, Control X A again. So it's a pretty much Emacsy interface, but it works pretty well. So yes, yes. How about Vim? I don't know. Sorry. Okay, so this is a version of the kinetic container with pretty much the same setup, except doesn't have any source code downloaded for Poke. It has Poke installed, but it doesn't have any source code. And it has this guy as the Debuginfod URL. Who is this guy? This guy is a local server that's running in another container, a local Debuginfod server. And I have modified it and modified the DDEBs that it indexes so that it can index source code as well, not only Debuginfo. Right, so as you have seen, I have not downloaded anything other than like apt install GDB and poke. And I'm going to start. Same thing happened. You start GDB, it reads the Debuginfo for the binary you're debugging. And then if you start the program, it will read everything that it needs and the source code. So this source code came over the wire. It's local now because GDB downloaded it and it put in that cache directory that I mentioned, but I didn't have to fiddle with apt source, apt install dpkg dev, nothing like that. It just works. And it works for libraries that Poke links against as well. It works for, anyway, multiple versions of Poke. So yes, this is awesome. And this is what I'm actually working on next. It involves some work on the archive as well. So during the previous week, I was talking to Steve, I was talking to Brian, about my ideas on how to change the build process in the archive so that Debuginfod can actually index the files and do the right thing, because right now it can't because of the paths that are embedded into the Debuginfo files. So I'm changing that in Ubuntu. Eventually, this will trickle down into Debian, or trickle up. But the problem is that Ubuntu is like in this sort of situations, it's easier to make these big changes. Like Debian requires a lot of conversation, a lot of politics, and it can take like months and months. So I'm happy that we got both Steve, Brian, and I. We got to a place where we're actually the three of us are happy with the proposal, and I'm going to be working on that. So the other things I will be working on for this cycle is index debug information from other producers. So snaps is something that Snap people were like, oh yeah, you got to do that for Snap as well. And I said, yes, I'd love to. You just have to give me the debug info. So we're working on how to access that debug info, on how to actually make it available for Debuginfod and special PPAs. I don't intend to support all PPAs, of course. That would be insane. But special PPAs the ESM PPAs for just extended support for Xenio, for example. Those would be very nice. And the SEG team, the support team, they are all into it. So they really like the service, and they want me to expand it. And as I said before, I'd like to provide more GDBs for people who are using Focal, Bionic, so they can use this service without having to compile their own GDB, which is kind of complicated sometimes. So yeah, via backports. And for Jamie, as I said, I'm still working with the SRU team. Maybe we're going to do an SRU there. I don't know. Let's see how it unfolds. But if you'd like to learn more, there's I maintain the documentation for the service in the Ubuntu server guide, so it is there. I've already received some suggestions to move this out of the server guide because maybe it's not like server related. Anyway, I am part of the server team, so that was like what my manager kind of suggested me to do, and I thought it was a good idea. So, but I'm always open to suggestions. There's the upstream documentation, which is a single page, like it's just a very, very brief explanation of what the service is. You can see that a lot of distros are already supporting the service. So there's Fedora, Debian, Arch, OpenSUSE, others. And this is basically the reason I wanted to do this for Ubuntu, because we were lagging behind, And if I can get the source code indexing this cycle to work, that would be awesome. And it would put us on par with Fedora. So that's my goal right now. I'm Sergio DJ at the various Ubuntu channels, and my email is sergiodj@ubuntu.com or debian.org if you don't remember the ubuntu.com part. So I think that's pretty much what I have. And of course, Dimitri has a question. Sorry, you have to use the mic. Yeah, I think so. Yes, it is.
How can one use Debuginfod without GDB?
Without GDB. So, like, is there a question about like what other soft?
How can I download all of the debug symbols without GDB? Because I'm not using GDB.
You're not using GDB, okay. So, yeah.
Rebel Dwarf.
Right. So Binutils,
yes.
It has support for Debuginfod.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. But if you if you really want to debug yourself, there are API endpoints that you can like just request, and Debuginfod will send you the information over. There are other projects that support Debuginfod. For example, SystemTap, because the guy who created Debuginfod is actually the SystemTap maintainer. So I think it was the first project. And also there's the Seven Dwarfs from Arnaldo, and other like Perf supports Debuginfod. So yeah, you have a lot of. Yeah. Can you pass it over, please? Thank
you. Two questions. If you're doing, if you're in a cross-architecture situation and you're running GDB on your host, and say you've got a smaller system that's, I don't say, ARM-based, and you're running a GDB server on there, will it work in this situation? Does the GDB server on the target, if I'm calling GDB on my host that's x86, does it know that I'm talking to a GDB server that needs to pull in ARM64 packages?
The cool thing is it doesn't need to know. It just needs to know the build ID.
Okay.
So as long as like the build ID is indexed by Debuginfod, it doesn't matter which architecture you're on. Like if you get like a poke binary compiled in Ubuntu and debug it in Fedora, and point GDB to Ubuntu's Debuginfod server, it will get the debug info. So it doesn't matter.
Okay.
Yeah.
And then my second question was, so it was cool when it brought in all the dependencies, transitive dependencies that needed the debug symbols.
Yeah.
Are they ephemeral? Like, does it clean up after itself, or are they cached?
No, it does not. So
Okay.
that is actually something that I have to write in the guide, because that was a question already from one of our team members. You have to be conscious about this space yourself. Debuginfod will not clean up after itself. So because we're talking about debug info, the cache directory can grow quite a lot. So yeah.
Thank you.
Maybe you can install a systemd user timer unit to clean the caches.
That would be good. Yeah, good idea actually. Yeah.
I have a question. Why did you set up two servers, one for Debian and one for Ubuntu? Isn't it feasible to just have one? I mean, technically, not.
No, technically it could be
I mean,
one server for the whole.
Yeah, because the build ID is the source. Correct. I'm not politically asking anything.
Yeah,
I'm just asking if technically it's possible to have a local instance for my company-based software, because I don't want to push. This is a business problem to push. So
That's a great question, and yes, it is possible. Debuginfod, by design, it federates with other Debuginfod instances. So, in the in the Ubuntu Debuginfod instance, I configure it to also communicate with the Debian one. So, I mean, it's not needed because I'm indexing the entire Ubuntu archive, so there won't be anything. But if there's any Debian program that you're running locally and they would like to debug, and you can't find in Ubuntu's Debuginfod, you will contact the Debian server. And also, there's like the elfutils. There's a Debuginfod instance in elfutils that actually indexes every other Debuginfod instance out there. Yeah. So in theory, you can just point your system to the elfutils one, and you will find the debug info.
Wow.
Whatever. And also that specific scenario that you brought, it was actually a question when I set up the Debian Debuginfod. And yes, it is possible, for example, if you have a company and you have a proprietary program, shame on you, sorry. But if you don't want to release debug info outside, or even the source code or whatever, you can create your own locally and then like point your own to the Ubuntu one or the elfutils one. But only your users will have access to your local debug info.
So we can integrate with Yocto. I know you're
Yes.
aware of it.
Yes,
Yeah.
yes, totally, yeah. It works.
Last question, please.
Yeah, sure.
Why didn't you choose the hash to index also the source files?
It does index for using...
To retrieve the source file?
Yes, it indexes using the build ID hash and then the path.
But why the path?
What
I mean,
do you mean?
If you have the hash of all the source files in Ubuntu,
Right.
you just need to download that specific file. You don't care about the path.
The dwarf debug symbols, they encode actual textual paths.
Yes.
Yeah.
And multiple source paths match a single debug info file. So you have one-to-many relationship, and then there is multiple builds of the same source file as well, such that a hash of a full source file is not carried together with the relevant portions of the code that you're trying to debug. They only store file name and line number offset.
Yeah.
Okay, but if I also store the hash of the source file I built,
Yeah.
I just need to care about the line number.
Mhm.
Just download the file, whatever names it has.
Yeah.
That is my point about changing the system.
Yeah, that would require to change dwarf debug symbol
Yes.
format.
Correct.
Yes.
It changed last year, I think.
No. It's evolving format. It's
evolving,
not
but-
static, but it will need to have dwarf debug,
Yeah.
and it will make it grow in size a lot because normally the
Source file will have a lot.
yeah because if you hashes don't compress, but the source file name paths do compress.
Yeah. So if you for example, I have
It was something that came in.
I have the debug info for poke here. So if you look for this guy here, which is the path that GDB uses to construct the actual the path that he wants the source file. So this is modified. If you open this in Debian or Ubuntu right now, you won't find a string like this. You will find like a dot. and a relative path. This actually breaks the dwarf specification, because it says that this entity cannot be a relative path. Yeah, so Debian and Ubuntu are breaking, and I understand why. This was because of the reproducible builds project and all. But the right way to fix this is to make this full path, and then I can make Debuginfod correctly index things. So this is part of the work I'm doing that I mentioned. Like, it's gonna have to I'm gonna have to change how things are built in Ubuntu, and like this is part of the work. So yeah, I think there was go ahead.
Did you have to write some code to convert from ddebs in the Ubuntu archive to what Debuginfod expects, or is that natively supported by Debuginfod?
Sorry, can you repeat the question?
Yeah. So we have ddebs in the Ubuntu archive, debug debs, right?
Yeah.
Does Debuginfod just know how to work with those and create what's needed, or did you have to write some glue code to connect those together?
I didn't have to write glue code. I just have to teach how Debuginfod uncompresses the ddeb and which information it will look for. So let me show you this server that I'm running. If you look at the so this is the thing that I was saying. Like, it tells Debuginfod, hey, if you find a ddeb file, run this command and get this guy inside. So with this guy, Debuginfod uses libarchive, so you can work with this guy directly, and it works. Debuginfod actually.
Work with RPM or whatever you want.
Yes, whatever you want. So Debuginfod actually has an option to work with both RPM or ddeb or deb out of the box.
Yeah,
but the problem
command is much better to use.
I was thinking the same.
it is not much better, because
It's slower.
and not only it's slower, but unfortunately when I was using this command in Debian, I ran into some concurrency problems, and I don't know what happened, but it took me a while to investigate. I couldn't find the source of it, and then I opted to use BSD-tar directly, and it's working flawlessly. So while Debuginfod was scanning the entire Debian archive, it was erroring out on a bunch of files because of this command.
We want a bug report.
Yes, right. I will file one. Absolutely.
Just which deb tripped it up is good enough.
Right.
Because it means we have broken binaries in the archive.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
Possibly hand-built by people on purpose.
Right. Yeah, but this is working now
Binaries were still uploaded.
nicely. So
Good.
all it needs to do is get access to the data tar file, and then it can do its thing. So yeah. So I didn't need to do anything to support it. Yeah.
I have one more follow-up. No, it's not
Yeah.
a follow-up. It's a separate question. Is there if I want to produce Debuginfod compatible stuff for a random project, not a Debian project, not an RPM project, is there any alternative to standing up my own server? Is there a SaaS place where I can upload debug symbols to, or is my only option really to have somewhere that I stand up a server for myself?
Right now, I think your only option is to set up your own server. Yeah.
Okay.
All distros maintain their own servers.
Yeah, I'm
And
thinking not about distro, but a random
right.
personal project. Maybe I'll
Yeah.
produce a Docker image or something.
No,
with
there's
symbols for it.
yeah.
Or I upload something to PyPy. I want to upload symbols somewhere,
Yeah.
such that people could.
Okay.
Yeah. Yeah.
For the compiled modules. not-
That would be a good idea. Yeah, but it doesn't exist now.
So for Yocto, I have to take all the debug packages, put in the same directory, and then scan all of them at the end of my build.
Yes. And teach Debuginfod via the -z flag.
It's a SQLite database with all the hashes.
Yeah.
Correct.
Yeah.
Okay. With the path of
And
the file.
yeah, and for Ubuntu, that SQLite database is 150 gigabytes now.
Yeah, I was thinking about that.
So I'm gonna talk to upstream. I'm actually talking to them about other issues
This case.
to see if they can support other.
This is why Debian and Ubuntu have different servers.
Yeah, exactly. Well, yeah, the Debian database is 7 gigabytes, and Ubuntu because in Ubuntu we publish many kernel flavors, Many.
I wanted to say it's probably my fault.
Yeah, like each flavor has 1 gigabyte of debug info associated. So yeah. So
All of it is useless and redundant.
And nobody ever cared.
No. We publish debug info like twice or 3 times inside our debug packages
right.
for no reason.
Yeah, no, it's a mess. Like it was interesting because when I was syncing the archive, I was using rsync, and
You hit L and then it stopped.
I kid you not, I had to like fire up like 3 or 4 rsyncs separate for L and the rest. And the rest finished first. Yes. It is insane.
Lib, but for Linux.
For Linux, yeah. It's insane. So yeah.
How do you work with newer debs? I mean, you have an rsync, but Debuginfod is scanning new files.
Every 3 hours, it
So
rsyncs.
some cron job to,
Yes.
to rsync. And,
Yes. And I'm actually going to be working on this infrastructure part as well, because some of the Launchpad folks reach out to me, and they want me to use Launchpad Librarian instead of rsyncing. So this is gonna be a somewhat medium to big project, to write a poller that can consult the API all the time and download things. So yeah, but right now it's every 3 hours if I'm not mistaken, and yeah. Any more questions? This is awesome actually, because it's not all the time that I get to talk to people that understand the usefulness of this and also understand the problems behind this as well. So yeah. So I think that's it. I will be around in the hallway today. So talk to you guys later. Thank you.